I've spent the better part of 5 decades studying how civilizations respond to crisis. And if there's one pattern that emerges with absolute clarity across every society I've examined at Brown University, it's this: the gap between knowing disaster could strike and actually preparing for it represents the most dangerous form of collective denial humanity has ever perfected. We've become a nation that plans military operations years in advance, that architects skyscrapers to withstand century storms, that ensures everything from our smartphones to our pets, yet somehow millions of American households remain utterly unprepared for the one disruption that grows more likely with each passing month: the extended blackout. I'm Michael Williams, and over my career examining economic collapses, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and the resilience patterns that separate societies that endure from those that fracture, I've observed something profoundly unsettling about our current moment. We stand at a peculiar intersection where our grandparents' instinctive preparedness has been replaced by a fragile dependence on systems we barely understand, systems that experts now warn could fail far more catastrophically than most Americans realize. Before you dismiss this as another survivalist warning, I urge you to stay with me through this entire examination, because what I'm about to reveal isn't speculation, it's documented reality backed by government agencies, grid operators, and infrastructure engineers who've been sounding alarms that most media outlets have failed to amplify adequately. Comment below where you're watching from, your city and country, because understanding how these vulnerabilities manifest differently across regions will be crucial to what follows. The American power grid, that invisible backbone of modern existence, faces a convergence of threats that would have seemed unthinkable when I began my academic career. The Department of Energy released assessments in 2025 indicating that blackout hours could increase 100-fold by 2030, and this isn't environmental activism or political fear-mongering. This comes from engineers who manage the physical infrastructure keeping 330 million people connected to electricity every single day. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, published findings in December 2024 showing that more than half of North America faces elevated risk of energy shortfalls within the next 5 to 10 years, driven by what they term explosive demand growth colliding with a shrinking base of reliable power generation. We're retiring coal and natural gas plants at unprecedented rates, 104 gigawatts of dispatchable power closing while only 22 gigawatts of equivalent reliability comes online to replace it. Meanwhile, electricity demand surges from data centers processing artificial intelligence, from manufacturing reshaping, from vehicle electrification, from population growth concentrated in grid-vulnerable regions. The mathematics here aren't partisan, they're thermodynamic. You cannot indefinitely increase demand while decreasing supply without reaching a breaking point, and that breaking point manifests as blackouts. What makes this situation historically significant isn't just the technical vulnerability, but the cultural amnesia that accompanies it. 3 generations ago, American households maintained root cellars, canned vegetables from summer gardens, kept oil lamps and manual tools as standard equipment because electricity itself remained somewhat unreliable and living memory included times without it entirely. My own grandmother in rural Pennsylvania stored enough provisions to feed her family for months, not because she expected apocalypse, but because that's simply what responsible households did. You prepared for winter, for storms, for the inevitable disruptions that came with agricultural life tied to seasonal rhythms. That knowledge transfer broke down somewhere between the suburban explosion of the 1950s and the digital revolution of the 2000s. We built a civilization where every critical function, communication, food storage, water purification, heating, cooling, medical equipment, financial transactions depends on uninterrupted electrical current, yet we did so without building corresponding resilience into households themselves. The grid became invisible precisely because it worked so reliably for so long, and that invisibility bred a dangerous complacency. We stopped teaching children how to function without electricity because we assumed we'd never need to. We stopped maintaining backup systems because the primary system seemed invincible. We outsourced preparedness to utilities and government agencies, assuming they possessed infinite capacity to restore power quickly after any disruption. Recent events have shattered that assumption repeatedly, yet the lessons haven't penetrated deeply enough. Hurricane impacts across the Gulf Coast, winter storms in Texas, wildfire-related shutdowns in California, derecho winds across the Midwest. Each crisis revealed the same pattern. People who prepared minimally suffered minimally, while unprepared households faced days or weeks of genuine hardship that no emergency services could immediately alleviate. When Texas experienced grid failure during the February 2021 winter storm, people died not from the cold itself but from attempts to heat homes using improvised methods they didn't understand: charcoal grills indoors, causing carbon monoxide poisoning, generators placed too close to windows, houses burning down from candles left unattended. The tragedy wasn't the storm Texas has weathered worse weather historically. The tragedy was that modern Texans had lost the practical knowledge their ancestors possessed about surviving without electrical heating. Similarly, After hurricanes knock out coastal power for extended periods, emergency rooms fill with entirely preventable injuries, people cutting themselves with unfamiliar manual tools, suffering dehydration because they didn't store water properly, experiencing medication complications because they didn't plan for refrigeration loss. These aren't stories of unusual stupidity, they're evidence of competency erosion across an entire population. The economic dimension of this vulnerability deserves particular attention because it intersects with broader fragility patterns I've tracked throughout financial history. Supply chains operate on just-in-time principles that minimize inventory costs but maximize disruption vulnerability. When crisis strikes, the items people suddenly need vanish from stores within hours because there's no warehouse depth behind retail shelves anymore. I've interviewed store managers who describe the phenomenon. Normal shopping patterns show batteries, flashlights, and water selling steadily but slowly. The moment weather forecasts predict major storms, those same items disappear completely, often before the storm even arrives, because everyone simultaneously recognizes their lack of preparation and tries to remedy it at once. By the time the actual blackout occurs, stores have been picked clean, and restocking takes days or weeks because distribution centers weren't maintaining large reserves of emergency supplies, they were optimizing for cost efficiency instead. This creates a perverse situation where the people most likely to suffer during extended blackouts are often those with the least financial flexibility to prepare in advance, because preparation requires upfront investment during calm periods when the need isn't viscerally obvious. Inflation has compressed household budgets further, making it psychologically difficult to spend money on supplies you hope never to use, even though the cost of not having those supplies during crisis escalates exponentially. There's also a psychological component that I've observed repeatedly in my research on crisis response, what behavioral economists call normalcy bias, the cognitive tendency to underestimate the probability and severity of disasters because our lived experience hasn't included them. If you've experienced reliable electricity for 40 consecutive years, your brain literally cannot process the possibility of losing it for 40 consecutive days, even when engineers explicitly warn that such scenarios grow increasingly plausible. This bias affects wealthy and poor communities alike, though it manifests differently. Affluent households assume money will solve problems when they arise. They'll simply buy a generator or stay in a hotel without recognizing that during widespread blackouts, generators sell out instantly and hotels have no power either. Working-class households often face the opposite assumption that they lack resources to prepare meaningfully. So why bother without recognizing that basic preparedness costs less than most families spend monthly on streaming services and requires no special expertise, just intentional planning? Both groups share the fundamental miscalculation. They believe the gap between recognizing danger and responding to it will remain open indefinitely, that they'll have time to act once the threat becomes undeniable. But blackouts don't announce themselves weeks in advance. They happen, and suddenly you're either prepared or you're suffering, with no middle ground available. The infrastructure reality undergirding these risks has been documented extensively by entities with no ideological agenda beyond keeping lights on. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the United States energy infrastructure a C- grade, noting that most transmission lines were built in the 1950s and 60s with 50-year operational lifespans, meaning they're now decades past intended retirement. Maintenance backlogs grow as utilities face pressure to keep rates low while simultaneously investing in grid modernization, creating a perfect storm where the system becomes both older and more stressed. Extreme weather events, which have increased in frequency and intensity, strike this aging infrastructure with predictable results: more outages, longer restoration times, greater economic costs. Cyberactics represent another vector. Grid systems were never designed with cybersecurity as a priority because they were built before the internet existed, and retrofitting security onto systems with such distributed physical components presents enormous challenges. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and Department of Homeland Security have both published assessments indicating that coordinated attacks on just 9 critical substations could trigger nationwide blackouts lasting weeks. And these aren't hypothetical vulnerabilities. Substations have been physically attacked multiple times in recent years, suggesting someone has been probing defenses. I mention this not to generate fear but to establish that the professionals responsible for grid security themselves acknowledge these vulnerabilities publicly, which means the risk level has crossed the threshold from theoretical to operational. What I find most striking, having spent years examining how historical societies navigated infrastructure transitions, is how quickly competence can be lost and how slowly it returns. When Roman aqueducts failed during the empire's decline, it took centuries for European cities to rebuild comparable water systems. Because the engineering knowledge had been lost along with the infrastructure itself, we face a parallel risk with practical resilience: not that we'll lose electrical engineering expertise, but that we've already lost household-level competency in functioning without grid power. My students at Brown University Brilliant young people who can code algorithms and analyze complex data sets often cannot start a fire, purify water, or calculate how much food their household would need for a week without refrigeration. These aren't exotic survival skills, they're basic capabilities that every adult possessed 100 years ago. The knowledge didn't disappear because it became obsolete. It disappeared because uninterrupted electricity made it seem obsolete. Now, as grid reliability trends downward, we're rediscovering that those capabilities weren't optional luxuries but essential resilience factors. The question facing American households isn't whether you'll eventually experience an extended blackout, the statistical probability grows each year, but whether you'll face that experience as someone who prepared thoughtfully, or someone who assumed it couldn't happen to you. The difference between those two positions isn't just comfort level during the crisis itself, but whether you become a burden requiring rescue resources or a stable node capable of helping more vulnerable neighbors. Preparedness, properly understood, isn't individualistic hoarding, it's the foundation of community resilience. Because households that can sustain themselves don't drain emergency resources needed for hospitals, nursing homes, and truly vulnerable populations. This is why every major faith tradition, every indigenous wisdom system, every long-enduring culture has emphasized provision and preparation as moral imperatives, not optional activities. You prepare not because you're afraid, but because you're responsible to family, to neighbors, to the broader community that functions only when its constituent households maintain basic resilience. That understanding has been lost in our era of hyperconvenience, and recovering it requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. The systems we've trusted to maintain modern life are fragile in ways we've barely begun to acknowledge, and the window for comfortable preparation may be narrowing faster than most realize. The revelation that changed how I understand preparedness came not from academic research but from interviewing families after the 2021 Texas grid failure, when I discovered that households with identical supply lists experienced vastly different outcomes based on a factor most preparedness guides completely ignore: practical knowledge. One family had 3 flashlights but no batteries that fit them. Another owned a water filter still in its packaging, instructions unread, useless when their taps ran dry. A third had purchased a generator years earlier but stored it with fuel still in the carburetor, which had gummed up the engine, rendering it inoperable precisely when they needed it most. These weren't careless people, they were educated professionals who had checked preparedness off their mental to-do list by acquiring items without understanding them. This pattern repeats across every crisis I've studied, and it reveals something most survival literature misses entirely. The real emergency isn't lacking supplies, it's lacking competency. We've created a society where ownership substitutes for understanding, where people believe that buying a piece of equipment equals being prepared to use it effectively under stress. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what preparedness actually means, and it's why I'm going to approach the specific essentials differently than you've likely encountered elsewhere. Each item I discuss exists not as a product to purchase, but as a capability to develop, a skill to practice, a system to understand before crisis forces you to learn under the worst possible conditions. Let's begin with the most basic need that fails first and whose absence creates immediate psychological distress: illumination. When grid power dies, darkness arrives with a completeness that shocks people accustomed to urban light pollution. You cannot read, cannot navigate your own home safely, cannot signal for help, cannot maintain the routines that provide psychological stability. The instinct is to grab flashlights, but here's where preparedness diverges from panic buying. Effective lighting preparedness requires multiple redundant systems, operating on different power sources because any single system will eventually fail. You need battery-powered flashlights with LED bulbs that conserve power, and critically, you need batteries in the correct sizes stored properly, which means cool, dry locations, checking expiration dates, rotating stock. But batteries deplete, so you also need rechargeable systems: solar-powered lanterns that charge during daytime and provide evening light, hand-cranked flashlights that generate power mechanically. Then you need fire-based backup candles with proper holders that prevent house fires, oil lamps if you understand their ventilation requirements. Each layer provides redundancy, and redundancy is the engineering principle that keeps critical systems functional. NASA doesn't send astronauts into space with one oxygen system. They build multiple backups because failure isn't acceptable. Your household lighting deserves the same philosophy, because navigating stairs in complete darkness with children or elderly family members present creates injury risk that overwhelms emergency rooms during blackouts. The second category that catches households unprepared is water, which urbanization has rendered invisible to most Americans. Turn the tap and clean water appears, a miracle of municipal engineering that fails completely when pumping stations lose power. The human body requires approximately half a gallon daily for drinking alone, more in heat or during physical exertion, and a gallon per person daily when including minimal hygiene needs. A family of 4 needs 28 gallons weekly, and extended blackouts frequently last 1 to 3 weeks in areas with significant infrastructure damage. That's 84 gallons minimum. which sounds overwhelming until you realize it fits in a corner of a garage using food-grade water storage containers that cost less than most families spend on a single restaurant meal. But storage is only half the equation because stored water eventually depletes and must be replenished from questionable sources. This requires purification capability filters rated for bacteria and protozoa removal, chemical purification tablets as backup, and critically, the ability to boil water using non-electric heat sources. Every one of these methods has limitations. Filters clog and must be replaced. Tablets have shelf lives. Boiling requires fuel. Comprehensive preparedness means understanding each method's constraints and maintaining multiple options. During Hurricane Katrina, people died of dehydration in a city surrounded by water because they lacked purification methods and didn't understand that drinking contaminated water creates medical emergencies that compound crisis conditions. The knowledge gap killed more effectively than the storm itself. Power generation represents the modern essential that didn't exist in our grandparents' preparedness paradigm but has become critical as medical devices, communication, equipment, and information access define survival in contemporary context. Portable power stations, essentially large batteries with multiple output options, have dropped dramatically in price while increasing in capability, and when paired with solar panels, they provide renewable electricity for charging phones, running CPAP machines, powering refrigeration for medications like insulin that require cold storage. The calculation here isn't about maintaining normal lifestyle but about sustaining critical functions. You're not running your air conditioning and entertainment system. You're keeping the diabetes medication that prevents medical crisis viable, maintaining the cell phone that lets you contact emergency services or receive official updates, preserving the ability to access information when radio and television stations go dark. But these systems require understanding charge rates, power consumption, battery degradation over time. A power station rated for 500 watt-hours sounds impressive until you calculate that a small refrigerator draws 150 watts continuously, meaning your battery depletes in 3 to 4 hours unless you're actively recharging it, which requires sunlight and properly angled solar panels. People who buy these systems without testing them during non-emergency periods discover their ignorance at the worst possible moment. Food preparedness exposes another layer of lost competency because modern Americans have outsourced nutrition almost entirely to systems requiring constant refrigeration and frequent shopping. The average household maintains perhaps 3 days of food that remains edible without cooking or refrigeration. Yet extended blackouts render most refrigerated and frozen food dangerous within 48 hours depending on outside temperatures. Effective preparedness requires shifting toward shelf-stable foods with multi-year viability: canned proteins, dried beans and rice, peanut butter, whole grain crackers, dried fruits, nuts. But here's the critical element most people miss. You must regularly eat these foods under normal conditions because crisis is not the time to discover your children refuse to eat the supplies you stockpiled or that canned goods you purchased cause digestive distress in your household. Food familiarity provides psychological comfort during stress, and preparing meals without electricity requires non-electric cooking methods you've actually practiced. Camping stoves running on propane canisters work excellently but require outdoor use or extremely well-ventilated spaces because they produce carbon monoxide. Charcoal grills provide cooking heat but take longer and require understanding fire management. Having a manual can opener sounds absurdly basic until you're staring at canned food with no way to access it, which happened to thousands during recent hurricanes. The pattern repeats: endlessly obvious needs becoming crises because we never practice the basics. If this information is helping you understand preparedness differently than you've encountered before, take a moment to like this video so it reaches more people who need this perspective. Subscribe and activate the notification bell because I'll be continuing this series with specific deep dives into skills that matter as much as supplies. And comment below with your city and country. I'm curious where viewers are watching from and whether these infrastructure vulnerabilities manifest similarly in your region, because understanding geographic patterns helps everyone prepare more effectively. Communication failure during blackouts creates isolation that amplifies psychological stress and prevents coordination with family members, neighbors, and emergency services. Cell towers typically maintain 2 to 4 hours of backup power, after which mobile phones become useless except as flashlights. Internet depends entirely on powered infrastructure and fails quickly. This severs the information umbilical cord that modern humans depend on unconsciously: no weather updates, no official instructions, no contact with relatives, no ability to verify rumors or counter misinformation that spreads rapidly during crisis. Emergency radios, particularly hand crank or solar-powered models that receive NOAA weather broadcasts and AM/FM stations, provide critical information flow when digital infrastructure collapses. But again, you must know which frequencies carry emergency broadcasts in your region, how to operate the radio before crisis hits, whether local stations have backup power to continue broadcasting. During widespread outages, many commercial stations go dark, leaving only a few emergency broadcasters active. Some preparedness-focused households maintain CB radios or ham radio equipment, which operate independently of infrastructure and enable communication across distances when proper licenses and knowledge exist. The Federal Communications Commission has seen applications for amateur radio licenses increase substantially as more Americans recognize that decentralized communication provides resilience that cellular networks cannot match. Two-way radios work excellently for family coordination within several miles, letting you maintain contact with household members or organize neighborhood response without depending on restored infrastructure. Climate control without electricity kills more Americans during extended blackouts than any other single factor because human bodies tolerate remarkably narrow temperature ranges, and modern construction often prioritizes energy efficiency over passive survivability. Homes built with minimal thermal mass, large windows, and HVAC dependency become death traps in temperature extremes. Winter blackouts require layered clothing, emergency blankets that reflect body heat, chemical hand warmers, sleeping bags rated for extreme temperatures, and critically, understanding how to create insulated spaces within larger homes, closing off rooms, hanging blankets over doorways, concentrating people in smaller areas where body heat accumulates. Summer blackouts demand opposite strategies: ventilation, staying hydrated, avoiding physical exertion during peak heat, utilizing cooling towels, understanding signs of heat stroke. Elderly populations and very young children face highest risk because their thermoregulation systems work less efficiently. Yet most households have never conducted the thought experiment of how they'd maintain survivable temperatures for 72 consecutive hours without power, which means they're planning to learn through potentially fatal trial and error. Emergency blankets cost $2 and weigh ounces but save lives by preventing hypothermia. Hand warmers provide immediate heat in dangerous situations. Battery-powered fans move air during heat emergencies. None of this requires expensive equipment, just intentional thinking about physiological needs and how to meet them without electrical assistance. Sanitation becomes crisis level within 24 hours of blackout in any area where toilets depend on electric pumping systems, which includes most urban and suburban developments. When you cannot flush, waste accumulates, creating disease vectors and psychological distress that compounds other emergency stresses. Solutions exist but require advanced preparation: portable camping toilets, heavy-duty trash bags with chemical treatments that neutralize odors and begin waste breakdown, understanding how to create emergency latrine systems if blackouts extend beyond days into weeks. This is unglamorous preparedness that most people avoid contemplating. But waterborne disease has killed more humans throughout history than warfare, and those diseases explode during infrastructure collapse when sanitation fails. Having supplies means nothing without knowledge. You must understand proper waste disposal that doesn't contaminate water sources, hygiene practices that prevent disease transmission, how to maintain cleanliness when running water disappears, hand sanitizer, disinfecting wipes, soap that doesn't require water, feminine hygiene supplies, diapers if household includes infants. These mundane items become crisis essentials. Paper products that Americans take for granted vanish from stores instantly when panic buying begins. So maintaining reasonable reserves during calm periods eliminates desperate searches during chaos. Medical preparedness extends far beyond adhesive bandages and antibiotic ointment because blackout injuries follow predictable patterns that overwhelm emergency services. People cut themselves using unfamiliar manual tools. They burn themselves cooking over open flames. They fall navigating dark spaces. They suffer medication complications when refrigeration fails. Comprehensive first aid kits include trauma supplies, tourniquets, pressure bandages, chest seals because response times extend dramatically when ambulances face impassable roads or communications failures. But equipment without training is worse than useless because incorrect tourniquet application causes permanent damage and panicked people make devastating mistakes. Organizations like the Red Cross and community colleges offer first aid certification that teaches not just what supplies exist but when and how to use them correctly. Prescription medications present their own challenges. Most Americans maintain 30-day supplies at most, yet refill processes depend entirely on powered infrastructure. Discussing extended prescription supplies with physicians before crisis hits, understanding which medications absolutely require refrigeration versus which tolerate temperature variation, maintaining updated medication lists that emergency responders can reference. These preparations seem paranoid until they prevent death. People with chronic conditions face existential risk during infrastructure collapse, and that risk grows as American society ages and more households include individuals dependent on regular medication. This isn't speculation but documented pattern from every recent extended blackout where preventable medical emergencies overwhelmed hospitals. The psychological dimension of preparedness receives insufficient attention despite determining whether households endure with dignity or fracture under stress. Extended blackouts eliminate normal routines, entertainment, information flow, creating psychological strain that manifests as anxiety, depression, family conflict. Having books, board games, playing cards, musical instruments, craft supplies, anything that occupies minds without electricity provides normalcy, anchors that maintain mental health. Children particularly need routine and distraction, and parents who've prepared activities specifically for blackout scenarios help kids process crisis without trauma. Faith communities often emphasize that spiritual preparation matters as much as material preparation because people need meaning frameworks that contextualize suffering and provide hope during extended hardship. Prayer, meditation, scripture reading, philosophical reflection. These practices cost nothing but provide psychological resilience that purely material preparedness cannot match. Historical accounts from Depression-era families and wartime populations consistently show that households maintaining spiritual practices and cultural traditions endured psychological strain better than those focused solely on physical survival. This represents wisdom our productivity-obsessed culture has largely abandoned, but which becomes immediately relevant when normal distraction mechanisms disappear and people face themselves without digital anesthesia. What separates households that endure from those that fracture comes down to a quality I've observed across every resilient society I've studied: the cultivation of practical competency as an ongoing practice rather than emergency reaction. Preparedness isn't a checklist you complete, but a lifestyle you inhabit, where you regularly practice skills during calm periods so they become automatic during crisis. You test your emergency lighting systems quarterly. You cook meals using your camping stove so you understand its quirks. You run through evacuation procedures with family members. You know your neighbors and have discussed mutual aid before disaster forces conversation. You maintain physical fitness that lets you function effectively under stress. You practice situational awareness and decision-making under pressure. These capabilities cannot be purchased in stores or acquired overnight. They develop through intentional cultivation over months and years, and they represent the true substance of preparedness that remains after panic buying exhausts store shelves and reveals how many people confused shopping with readiness.